Chapter 1. Before the number meant anything. Before the number 9 became a symbol, before it carried weight, expectation, or mythology. It was just a shirt. In football's earliest organized years, numbers didn't exist at all. Players took to the pitch without any indication of role or position stitched onto their backs. The game was raw, unstructured, more a physical contest than a tactical one. Teams in the late 19th century typically lined up in something resembling a 2-3-5 formation, 2 defenders, 3 halfbacks, and 5-5 forwards spread across the attacking line. 5 forwards. It sounds almost reckless by modern standards, but this was a different game entirely. Football in those early decades wasn't about control or patience. It was about territory, about getting the ball forward as quickly as possible and overwhelming the opposition with numbers in attack. The idea of a single central striker, one man tasked with leading the line alone, hadn't yet been conceived. Everyone attacked. Everyone pressed forward. The goal was chaos directed at goal. When shirt numbers were first formally introduced, the Football League in England began requiring them in 1939. They were assigned by position in a logical, almost mathematical way. The goalkeeper wore 1, defenders wore 2 and 3, midfielders took 4, 5, and 6, and the forwards, those 5 attacking players, wore 7 through 11. The number 9 fell to the center forward. Not because it was special, not because it was chosen with any ceremony, simply because of where he stood on the pitch. But something interesting happens when you give a position a number. It starts to mean something. The center forward in those early formations was the most central of the 5 attackers. Flanked by inside forwards on either side and wide men beyond them, he occupied the heart of the attacking line. He was the focal point, the man the ball was meant to find, the player closest to goal when it mattered most. In many ways, the position defined itself through simplicity. Score goals, lead the line, be there when it counts. There was no complexity in the brief, no tactical nuance attached to the role. The number 9 existed in those early days to do one thing and do it without hesitation. Put the ball in the net. And in that simplicity, something powerful took root. Because football, even in its rawest, most chaotic early form, understood instinctively that goals were everything, that the man who scored them was the man the crowd came to see, that the center forward, more than any other player on the pitch, carried the weight of the team's ambitions. Goals meant winning, and winning meant everything. So even before tactics matured, even before formations were debated and systems were drawn on chalkboards, even before the word striker entered the football vocabulary, the number 9 was already becoming something, a target, a focal point, a player set apart from the rest. As the sport grew through the early decades of the 20th century, crowds grew with it. Football was becoming more than a game. It was becoming a cultural institution, particularly in England, where the professional league was the most developed in the world and where working-class communities built their entire weekends around Saturday afternoons at the ground. And in those grounds, in those packed terraces, one thing became clear very quickly. The number 9 was the hero. He was the man they sang for, the man they groaned for when he missed, the man they lifted onto their shoulders when he scored. No other position carried that emotional charge. The goalkeeper was admired, the full-back was respected, the winger was loved for his trickery, but the center forward, the number 9, was worshipped because he was the one who decided things. In the years that followed, as football began to organize itself more seriously, as leagues professionalized, as international competition developed, as tactics became a genuine conversation, the center forward evolved with it. But that evolution didn't dilute what the number 9 was. It deepened it. The position grew more demanding, more specific, more psychologically complex because the more football understood about goals, about how hard they were to score, about how rare truly clinical finishing was, the more it valued the man who could do it consistently. By the time the 1930s arrived, the center forward wasn't just a position, it was a calling, a particular type of player, a particular type of mind, someone who could carry the hopes of tens of thousands of people into the penalty area and remain calm enough to finish. Someone who understood, at some deep instinctive level, that the number on their back wasn't just a number, it was a responsibility. And the players who would come to define that responsibility, the legends who would make the number 9 one of the most storied in the history of sport, were only just beginning to emerge. This was the foundation, modest, unadorned, simple. But foundations don't need to be grand, they just need to hold. And this one would hold for over a century, shifting, stretching, being tested and reimagined, but never, not once, losing its essential truth. The number 9 was the one who scored. Everything else was detail. Chapter 2. The Gods of the Center Circle. In the 1920s and 1930s, football found its first true heroes. Not teams, not systems, not managers with notebooks and tactical visions. Individual men, center forwards who scored with such frequency, such ruthlessness, such almost supernatural consistency that the crowds who watched them struggled to find adequate words. Men who made the number 9 shirt feel like something sacred, something that had to be earned, not simply assigned. This was the golden age of the pure goal scorer. And it began, in many ways, with one man, Dixie Dean. William Ralph Dean, known to everyone who ever saw him play as Dixie, was born in Birkenhead in 1907 and went on to become perhaps the most complete center forward English football has ever produced. He was everything the position demanded in that era and then considerably more. He was powerful without being crude, clinical without being cold, and in the air, with his head connecting with crosses delivered from wide positions, he was simply without peer. In the 1927-28 Football League season, Dixie Dean did something that has never been repeated. He scored 60 league goals, 60, in a single season. To place that in context, top scorers in the modern Premier League consider 25 goals an outstanding return. The record for a single Premier League season stands at 34, set by Andy Cole and Alan Shearer. Even accounting for differences in era, in pitches, in the number of games played, 60 goals remains a figure that defies rational explanation. Dean didn't just break the previous record that season, he obliterated it. And he did so in the final game of the campaign, needing a hat trick against Arsenal at Goodison Park to reach the landmark. He got it. Of course he got it. Because that is what men like Dixie Dean did. They found a way. But Dean wasn't an anomaly. He was the peak of a wave. Across Europe in those same decades, center forwards of similar stature were emerging, different in style, identical in impact. In Italy, there was Giuseppe Meazza. Meazza was a different kind of number 9 to Dean. Where Dean was a physical force, a battering ram with the finishing instincts of a surgeon, Meazza was elegant, technical, capable of creating as much as finishing. He played for Internazionale and AC Milan and represented Italy during their dominant period of the 1930s, winning back-to-back World Cups in 1934 and 1938. The San Siro Stadium, shared today by Inter and Milan, was renamed the Stadio Giuseppe Meazza in his honor. Not a trophy, not a street, a stadium. That is the measure of what he meant. In Hungary, there was György Sarosi, a graceful, technically refined forward who captained his country and scored with remarkable regularity throughout the 1930s. In Austria, there was Matthias Sindelar, known as Der Papierene, the paperman, for his slender frame and fluid movement. He was a center forward who drifted, who thought, who played the position with a kind of intelligence that felt almost ahead of its time. Different countries, different styles, different languages, but the same essential truth. The number 9 was the most important player on the pitch. What united all of these men, Dean, Meazza, Sindelar, and the others who defined the era, was a relationship with goal scoring that went beyond technique. beyond fitness, beyond even talent in the conventional sense. It was instinct. The great center forwards of this period seemed to exist in the penalty area differently to other players. They arrived at the right moment. They found space that didn't appear to exist. They made decisions in fractions of seconds that other players couldn't process in minutes. Football people called it many things: a nose for goal, a striker's instinct, being in the right place at the right time, but none of those phrases fully captured it. Because it wasn't luck, it wasn't accident, it was something learned so deeply that it had become unconscious. A map of the penalty area burned so thoroughly into the mind that the body simply moved there, automatically, inevitably, correctly. This was the gift of the great number nines, and it was, in many ways, unteachable. You could work on finishing technique, you could improve aerial ability, you could develop movement patterns and study opponents, but that final, essential quality, that sense of where the ball was going to be before it arrived, was either there or it wasn't. The players who had it became legends. The players who didn't, regardless of everything else they possessed, remained merely good. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, football was interrupted, brutally, completely, by the Second World War. Leagues suspended, careers cut short. Entire generations of players who might have become immortals instead became ghosts. Names in record books with years missing, what-ifs swallowed by history. Dixie Dean's career wound down. Miaza played on into the war years before finally retiring. The generation that had defined the center forward was passing, but the position they had shaped, the expectations they had created, endured. When football resumed after the war, crowds flooded back to grounds across England and Europe with a hunger for the game that felt almost desperate. Years of darkness had made them need it more, not less, and what they needed, more than anything, was a hero, a number 9, someone to believe in. In England, Tommy Lawton stepped into that space, a center forward of immense physical presence and extraordinary heading ability. Compared by many directly to Dean himself, Lawton carried the tradition forward with authority. He scored freely at every club he represented and for the national team, maintaining the standard that Dean had set. The template held: power, presence, goals. The center forward as the undisputed focal point of the team. But even as Tommy Lawton was maintaining that tradition on English pitches, something was stirring elsewhere. In South America, in Central Europe, a different idea about what football could be, about how goals could be scored, about how attackers could move, about what a number 9 might become if you asked different questions of the position. The world was getting smaller. Football was beginning to share ideas across borders, and the center forward, that seemingly settled, perfectly defined role, was about to meet its first great challenge. The pure goal scorer wasn't going anywhere, but the game around him was changing, and change in football has a way of reshaping everything it touches, even the sacred, even the number 9. Chapter 3. The world opens up. For the first half of the 20th century, football existed in silos. England had its way, South America had its way, Central Europe had its way, and rarely did those worlds collide with enough regularity to truly learn from one another. International football existed. The World Cup had begun in 1930, but travel was slow, broadcasting was limited, and the flow of tactical ideas across borders was more trickle than flood. The number 9 in that environment had developed largely along one track: big, strong, clinical, central. A man who held the line, attacked crosses, and scored goals through force of presence as much as anything else. The Dixie Dean model, the Tommy Lawton model, the center forward as immovable object, planted in the opposition half, waiting to be found, lethal when he was. But in the early 1950s, that model was about to be shaken. Not gradually, violently. On the 25th of November 1953, England hosted Hungary at Wembley Stadium. England had never lost a home international match to a team from outside the British Isles. Wembley was considered a fortress. The English game considered itself, quietly, confidently, without much self-examination, the best in the world. Hungary left with a 6-3 victory. The scoreline told part of the story, the manner of it told the rest. Hungary, the mighty Magyars, as they had come to be known, didn't just beat England. They dismantled them. They played a different game, a more fluid, more intelligent, more positionally complex version of football that the English players on the pitch that day simply had no answer for. And at the center of the confusion they caused was a single tactical idea. Nándor Hidegkuti. Hidegkuti wore the number 9 shirt for Hungary. But he didn't play like a number 9. Not in any way the English defenders recognized. Instead of holding the line, instead of planting himself near the opposition penalty area and waiting for service, Hidegkuti dropped deep into midfield spaces, between the lines, into areas where center halves didn't know whether to follow him or hold their position. If they followed him, they left space in behind for Hungary's other forwards, Sándor Kocsis and Ferenc Puskás, to exploit. If they didn't follow him, Hidegkuti had time and space to receive the ball, turn, and create. England's defenders had no answer because the question was entirely new. They had prepared for a center forward. They got something else entirely. Hidegkuti scored a hat trick that afternoon at Wembley. But more significant than his goals was what his movement represented. For the first time on the grandest stage, the number 9 had been used not as a fixed point, but as a moving problem. A player whose value came not from being in the penalty area, but from being somewhere unexpected, somewhere that forced the opposition to think in ways they hadn't prepared for. It was a revolution disguised as a football match, and the reverberations spread across the sport. If Hidegkuti cracked the idea open, it was the great South American sides of the same era who poured color into it. Brazil in the 1950s were developing a style of football that felt almost like a different art form, technical, rhythmic, built on individual expression within collective structure. The game they played had roots in the culture that produced it, joyful, improvised, endlessly creative. Their 1958 World Cup winning side, the tournament that introduced a 17-year-old Pelé to the world, featured a forward line of extraordinary variety. Pelé himself, still a teenager, operated with a freedom that defied simple categorization. He scored goals. He created them. He drifted. He drove forward. He was, in many ways, beyond the definition of any single position. But it was the balance of that Brazilian team that mattered as much as any individual. Didi, operating in deeper midfield, controlled tempo with extraordinary calm. Garrincha terrorized from the right wing, and the forwards moved in patterns that felt less like a formation and more like improvised music, responsive, intuitive, always in conversation with one another. The idea of the isolated number 9, the lone focal point waiting for the ball, felt less complete in that context. Goals, Brazil were demonstrating, could come from everywhere, from any angle, from any player, if the system was fluid enough and the players intelligent enough. This wasn't a rejection of the center forward. It was an expansion of the possibilities around him. Meanwhile, in Spain, Real Madrid were constructing something that would define club football for a decade. The great Real Madrid side of the late 1950s and early 1960s, winners of the first 5 European Cups, featured perhaps the greatest concentration of attacking talent ever assembled on a single team. Alfredo Di Stefano, Ferenc Puskás, Francisco Gento. Di Stefano is the figure worth pausing on longest, because Di Stefano, more than almost any other player of his generation, embodied what the center forward was beginning to become. He wasn't a number 9 in the classical sense. He wasn't a number 10 either. He wasn't a midfielder or a winger. He was all of them. Di Stefano covered the entire pitch. He dropped deep to collect the ball. He drove forward into attacking positions. He created for others. He scored himself, prolifically, consistently, across more than a decade at the highest level. He pressed opponents when possession was lost. He organized the team when it needed structure. He was, in the language that would come later, a complete footballer, and his existence, his sustained, brilliant, impossible to categorize existence, posed a question that football would spend the next 60 years trying to answer properly. What happens when the best player on the pitch refuses to be defined by a single position? What happens when the number 9 is also the number 10, also the engine of the team, also the first defender when the ball is lost? Real Madrid won 5 consecutive European Cups between 1956 and 1960. The question answered itself. Across these years, through Hungary's tactical earthquake at Wembley, through Brazil's joyful reinvention of attacking football, through Di Stefano's all-encompassing brilliance in Madrid, the number 9 was quietly being redefined. Not abandoned, not diminished, but stretched. The pure goal scorer still existed, still mattered, still filled grounds and won matches and carried teams on his shoulders. But the sport was beginning to understand that the center forward could be more than a finisher. That movement, intelligence, positional flexibility, these weren't alternatives to goal scoring. They were additions to it. The world of football had opened up. Ideas were crossing borders, styles were colliding, and out of that collision something new was forming. The number 9 of the 1960s and beyond would inherit all of this. The power of the English tradition, the intelligence of the Hungarian innovation, the freedom of the Brazilian approach, the completeness of Di Stefano's vision. And from that inheritance, they would build something extraordinary. The position was evolving. And the next chapter of that evolution would produce some of the greatest individuals the sport has ever seen. Chapter 4. The Age of the Immortals. If the 1950s cracked the number 9 open, the 1960s and 1970s filled it with gold. This was the era of the Immortals, the players who didn't just define the position for their generation, they defined it for all generations. The men whose names still carry weight in any conversation about the greatest footballers who ever lived, whose goals are still watched, whose records still stand, whose legacies still shape how the game thinks about the center forward today. This was the era that made the number 9 mythological, and it began with a boy from Brazil, Pelé. There is a difficulty that comes with writing about Pelé, a risk of defaulting to superlatives so familiar they've lost their meaning. The greatest of all time, the king of football, the one who could do everything. But beneath the mythology, beneath the decades of reverence and retrospective praise, there is a player whose actual achievements remain almost incomprehensible when examined clearly. Pelé won the World Cup 3 times. In 1958, aged 17. In 1962, despite injury limiting his involvement. In 1970, with what many consider the greatest international team ever assembled, he scored over 1,000 career goals, a figure disputed in its precise counting but not in its staggering scale. He scored in every type of way imaginable: headers, volleys, long-range strikes, delicate finishes, goals created from nothing, in spaces that shouldn't have existed, against opponents who knew what he was going to do and still couldn't stop him. What made Pelé different from the great center forwards who came before him was that combination of qualities Di Stefano had hinted at, but expressed with even greater athleticism, even greater technical brilliance, even greater instinctive genius. He could score, he could create, he could dribble past opponents as though they were obstacles in training. He could play through pressure, through pain, through the specific burden of being the most targeted player on every pitch he ever stood on. And he did all of it with a joy, a visible, infectious delight in the act of playing that made watching him feel like a privilege rather than simply entertainment. Brazil's 1970 World Cup campaign remains the gold standard of international football. That team, featuring Pelé, Jairzinho, Tostão, Rivellino, Carlos Alberto, played football that felt less like competition and more like an extended demonstration of what the sport could be at its absolute ceiling. Pelé was its heart, not just its best player, its soul, but the world of the number 9 in the 1960s and 1970s was not a solo exhibition. While Pelé illuminated South America and the global imagination, European football was producing its own generation of extraordinary center forwards, players who approached the position differently but with equal brilliance. In Italy, there was Gigi Riva. Riva is a name less familiar to modern audiences than Pelé or some of his contemporaries, but within Italian football, he occupies a place of absolute reverence. He remains Italy's all-time leading scorer. A left-footed striker of ferocious power and technical quality, Riva spent his entire career at Cagliari, a club from Sardinia who, built around him, won the only Serie A title in their history in 1970. He was direct, physical, utterly ruthless in front of goal, a pure number 9 in the most classical sense, but operating at a level that placed him among the elite of world football. In England, the position was finding different expressions. Jimmy Greaves was producing goal tallies that defied logic, 357 Football League goals at a time when defenders were permitted to make physical contact that would today result in immediate red cards. Greaves was not powerful in the Dixie Dean mold. He was slight, quick, almost casual in the way he finished. His goals arrived with a nonchalance that made them look easy. They were not easy. They were the product of an instinct so refined it appeared effortless, the same unconscious mapping of the penalty area that had made the great pre-war center forwards so devastating, expressed now through movement and technique rather than physical dominance. And then there was Denis Law, Scottish, fierce, explosive, a striker who played with an intensity that felt almost confrontational, as though scoring goals wasn't just his job, but his personal argument with the world. Law won the Ballon d'Or in 1964. He was electric in the air despite not being especially tall. His reflexes in the 6-yard box were among the quickest ever seen. At Manchester United, alongside Bobby Charlton and George Best, Law was part of a forward line that captured the imagination of English football in a way that still resonates. Across the continent, other names were writing their own chapters. Eusebio in Portugal, the Mozambique-born forward whose explosive pace and thunderous shooting made him one of the most feared strikers in Europe throughout the 1960s. His 1966 World Cup, in which he finished as the tournament's top scorer with 9 goals and led Portugal to third place, remains one of the great individual performances in the competition's history. Gerd Müller in West Germany. If Pelé was the poet of the center-forward position, all elegance and expression and visible joy, then Gerd Müller was the mathematician. He was not tall. He was not particularly quick. He did not dazzle with technique in the way Pelé or Eusebio could. He did not cover the pitch like Di Stefano or reinvent positional play like Hidekuti. What Gerd Müller did was score. With a frequency and a reliability and a cold, almost mechanical efficiency that made him one of the most extraordinary goal scorers the sport has ever produced. He scored 68 goals in 62 appearances for West Germany. He scored 365 goals in 427 Bundesliga appearances for Bayern Munich. He won the World Cup in 1974, scoring the winning goal in the final. He won the European Championship in 1972. He won the European Cup with Bayern in 1974, 1975, and 1976. His nickname was Der Bomber. But that slightly crude label didn't fully capture what he was. Because Müller wasn't simply powerful, he was precise. His movement in the penalty area was extraordinary, sharp, unpredictable changes of direction that wrong-footed defenders in tight spaces. His first touch under pressure was immaculate. His finishing, with either foot or his head, was almost never wasteful. He was, in the most complete sense, a penalty area predator. The game gave him half a chance. He took it, every time. Müller and Pelé represent in many ways the two poles of the position in this era. One expressed the number 9 through artistry and completeness, through an ability to influence every aspect of attacking play. The other expressed it through pure, devastating efficiency, through an almost superhuman capacity to be in the right place and to finish without hesitation. Both were correct. Both were extraordinary. Both produced careers that football is still trying to fully comprehend, and around them, supporting them, in conversation with them, the position was growing richer, more complex, more varied in its expressions. By the mid-1970s, football was entering a new phase of tactical development. Total football, Rinus Michels' revolutionary system at Ajax and with the Netherlands national team, was reshaping how the sport thought about positions entirely. Players rotated, systems were fluid. The idea of a fixed center forward, a player who stayed in one area and waited, felt increasingly limiting within that framework. Johan Cruyff, the greatest product of total football, wasn't a number 9 in any traditional sense, but his influence on how attacking players moved, how they used space, how they thought about their relationship with the rest of the team, that influence reached the center forward position profoundly. The number 9 of the late 1970s and beyond would need to be more than a finisher, more than a presence, more than a target. The game was demanding more, and the players who would answer that demand, who would take the inheritance of Pelé and Müller and everyone who came before them and build something new from it, were already emerging. In the coming decade, the center forward would reach a new peak, not of quantity, not simply of goals, but of completeness, of what a single player in that position, wearing that number, could be asked to do, and what they could deliver. Chapter 5. Power, Presence, and the Art of the Target Man. Not every revolution moves forward. Some move sideways. Some deepen what already exists. Some take a quality that has always been present in the position and elevate it to an art form so refined, so specialized, so demanding that it becomes its own distinct tradition. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, as football absorbed the lessons of total football and began demanding more tactical intelligence from its players, something interesting happened to the number 9. It split. Not cleanly, not with any formal announcement or deliberate design, but gradually, unmistakably, the center forward position began to divide into distinct expressions. On one side, the complete striker, the forward who could link play, drop deep, create as well as finish, exist as a fluid part of a complex system. And on the other side, the target man, raw, physical, imposing, a forward built not for elegance but for warfare, a player whose primary function was to receive the ball under pressure, hold it against defenders who were permitted, in an era of significantly more physical contact than today, to make his life extremely difficult and either finish or bring others into play. The target man wasn't a new idea. He had roots stretching back to the earliest center forwards, to the physical dominance of Dixie Dean in the air, to the presence of Tommy Lawton, to the English tradition of the big number 9 who led the line with his body as much as his feet. But in the 1980s, that tradition reached its fullest, most sophisticated expression, and nowhere more so than in England. The first division of the 1980s was a physically brutal environment. Pitches were heavy. Defending was aggressive in ways that modern football has largely eliminated. Center halves were permitted to challenge for the ball with a force that required center forwards to be able to absorb contact, stay on their feet, and still make good decisions. In that environment, the target man didn't just thrive, he was essential. The English game had built itself around his existence. Long balls played over the top or directly into the striker's chest, wingers delivering crosses to be attacked, second balls to be won from flick-ons. It was direct, it was physical, and when it worked, when you had the right man leading the line, it was devastatingly effective. Steve Highway, Tony Woodcock, Kerry Dixon. But the two names that define the English target man tradition in this era more completely than any others are Andy Gray and Mark Hughes. Andy Gray arrived at Wolverhampton Wanderers and then Everton with a physical presence that defenders found almost impossible to manage. He attacked crosses with a ferocity that felt almost reckless, throwing himself into challenges that risked serious injury with a frequency that coaches today would find alarming. He won aerial duels that seemed unwinnable. He scored goals from positions, diving headers at the far post, close-range volleys in congested penalty areas that required a complete indifference to personal safety. He was raw, powerful, and absolutely committed. Mark Hughes, Sparky as he was known universally, was a different but equally imposing version of the type. Built like a middleweight boxer with thighs that seemed almost disproportionate to the rest of him, Hughes combined physical strength with a technical quality that lifted him above the purely agricultural. He could control long balls with his chest under enormous pressure. He could hold off two defenders simultaneously while waiting for support, and his finishing, particularly his volleys, struck with a ferocity that made goalkeepers flinch, was spectacular. Hughes won the PFA Players Player of the Year award twice. He scored some of the most memorable goals in Manchester United's history. He was, in the most complete sense, the target man elevated to artistry. But England didn't have a monopoly on the type. In Scandinavia, a player was emerging who would take the physical center-forward tradition and carry it into the 1990s with a force that redefined the position across Europe. Ali McCoist in Scotland, Brian Laudrup's brother Michael, but most significantly, most overwhelmingly, a Norwegian forward who would become one of the most recognized strikers of his generation, Tore André Flo, Jan Åge Fjørtoft. And then, of course, Dion Dublin, Ian Wright, and the player who perhaps best bridged the gap between target man and complete striker in the English game of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Alan Shearer. Shearer deserves particular attention, not just because of what he achieved, but because of what he represented at the precise moment he arrived. He was physically imposing without being one-dimensional. He could hold the ball. He could finish with either foot. He was devastating in the air. He pressed. He worked. He led lines with an authority that made him the focal point of every team he played for. But he could also turn, could drive at defenders, could score from distance with a right foot that generated extraordinary power. When Shearer broke the British transfer record to return to Newcastle United in 1996 for £15 million, it felt less like a football transaction and more like a statement about what the number 9 was worth. What a true center forward, one who combined the physical tradition of the target man with enough technical quality to survive in a modernizing game, could mean to a club. He went on to score 260 Premier League goals, a record that still stands. But the story of the 1980s target man isn't only an English one. In Italy, where Serie A was becoming the most prestigious and tactically sophisticated league in the world, a different kind of physical forward was finding expression. Italian football valued defensive organization above almost everything, which meant that center forwards faced some of the best, most intelligent, most physically capable defenders on the planet every single week. To survive in that environment, to score in that environment, required something exceptional. Paolo Rossi had shown in 1982, with his extraordinary World Cup in Spain, 6 goals in 3 games after a 2-year ban from the sport, that even in Italy's defensive landscape, a clever, well-timed forward could be decisive. Rossi wasn't a target man in the physical sense. He was a poacher, quick, well-positioned, devastating when the chance arrived. But the Italian league also produced its share of powerful, dominant center forwards. Players who could bend the game to their presence through physicality and force of will. And as the 1980s ended and the 1990s began, Italy would become the stage for something entirely different, something that changed the conversation about the number 9 in a way that hadn't been changed since Di Stefano. A player who was neither purely physical nor purely technical, neither target man nor poacher, neither English tradition nor South American innovation, but something new, something complete. The world's most expensive player, the player who made defenders, world-class, experienced, intelligent defenders, look ordinary. The player who carried a nation's hopes, a club's identity, and the weight of expectation that comes with being considered by the time he was 21 years old, perhaps the greatest center forward the sport had ever produced, Marco van Basten. And the story of what he was and what he did and what he meant to the position, that belongs to the next chapter. Because Van Basten doesn't fit neatly into the story of the target man. He transcended it. He transcended almost everything. Chapter 6. The Complete Striker. There are players who are great, and then there are players who make you reconsider what greatness means. Marco van Basten was the second kind. He arrived at AC Milan in 1987 from Ajax, already a player of significant reputation, already a scorer of remarkable goals, already someone the football world had marked as exceptional. But what he became at Milan, under the management of Arrigo Sacchi and later Fabio Capello, in one of the most tactically sophisticated club environments the sport has ever produced, that was something different entirely. Van Basten was 6 feet 2 inches tall, which meant he could compete aerially with the most physical defenders in the world. He could hold the ball, he could be a target. He had the presence of the great English center forwards, the physicality that made him impossible to simply push off the ball. But he could also do things that physical forwards simply didn't do. His touch was extraordinary. His first control under pressure, the kind of contact that preserves the ball and creates half a yard of space in situations where defenders are right behind you, was as good as any forward who has ever played the game. His movement was subtle and intelligent in a way that recalled the great South American tradition. He drifted, he found pockets, he arrived at moments rather than waiting for them. And his finishing. His finishing was something else entirely. In the 1988 European Championship final, the Netherlands faced the Soviet Union. Van Basten received a cross from Arnold Müller on the right side of the penalty area, the ball dropping to him at a height and an angle that suggested to most rational observers that the correct decision was to control it, set it up, and find a simpler solution. Van Basten didn't find a simpler solution. He volleyed it, first time, on the turn, from an angle so acute that the goal appeared almost impossible to hit, let alone find the top corner of. It went in, perfectly, precisely, with a technique so complete and a decision made so quickly that even watching it, decades later, knowing exactly what is going to happen, it retains the power to produce a sharp intake of breath. It is, by wide consensus, one of the greatest goals ever scored, and it encapsulated everything Van Basten was. Physical enough to exist in the hardest environments, technical enough to do things others couldn't conceive of, clinical enough to finish chances that other forwards would miss, brave enough to attempt the extraordinary when the simpler option existed. He won 3 Ballon d'Or awards in 1988, 1989, and 1992. He won 3 Serie A titles with AC Milan, 2 European Cups, the European Championship with the Netherlands, and then, at the age of 28, an age at which great strikers are typically approaching the peak of their powers, a persistent ankle injury ended his career. He retired in 1995, having not played a competitive match since 1993. The cruelty of it was almost unbearable. A player of that quality, that completeness, that rarity, gone before the full arc of his greatness could be traced. Football mourned him while he was still technically a player, still attempting comebacks, still hoping the ankle would hold, and has never quite stopped mourning him since. But Van Basten's legacy wasn't only in what he achieved, it was in what he demonstrated was possible. He showed that the number 9 could be everything simultaneously. Physical and technical, powerful and subtle, a target and a creator, a player who scored simple goals from close range and impossible goals from impossible angles with equal comfort. He raised the definition of the complete striker, and in doing so, he set a standard that the players who followed him would spend their careers chasing. Some of them came very close. Ronaldo, not Cristiano Ronaldo, though his story belongs to this history too and will find its place, but Ronaldo Luis Nazario de Lima, R9, the original, the phenomenon. Born in Brazil in 1976, Ronaldo emerged in the early 1990s as something football had never quite seen before. A center forward with the pace of a winger, the technique of a playmaker, and the finishing instinct of the most clinical poacher. He was, in his peak years, roughly 1994 to 1998, and then again, between 2002 and 2003, the most devastating attacking player on the planet. At Barcelona, then Internazionale, then Real Madrid, Ronaldo did things that defied the physical logic of what a man his size moving at his speed should have been able to do technically. He controlled the ball at full sprint without it getting away from him. He changed direction at pace in ways that left defenders lunging at empty space. He finished with both feet. He scored from distance. He dribbled from deep and arrived in the penalty area still composed enough to make the right decision. His 1997 UEFA Cup Winners' Cup final goal for Barcelona, a solo run from inside his own half past multiple defenders, finished with a calm precision that felt almost contemptuous of the magnitude of the moment, remains one of the great individual goals in the history of the sport. His 1998 World Cup should have been his coronation. France hosted the tournament. Ronaldo was its dominant player, the man everyone expected to lift the trophy and confirm his place in the pantheon of all-time greats. And then, on the evening of the final, something happened. Ronaldo suffered what appeared to be a convulsive episode hours before the match. The nature of it has never been fully explained. He was initially left off the team sheet, then reinstated. He played. But the player who took the field against France that evening was not the Ronaldo who had dazzled throughout the tournament. Brazil lost 3-0. The image of Ronaldo sitting in the dressing room after, staring at nothing, hollowed out, became one of the defining photographs of that World Cup. But Ronaldo came back. After serious knee injuries that would have ended lesser careers, injuries that did, in truth, cost him years at the absolute peak of his abilities. He returned to the World Cup in 2002 and did something remarkable. He scored 8 goals, including both in the final against Germany, and lifted the trophy he had been denied 4 years earlier. The image of Ronaldo celebrating, arms wide, that gap-toothed smile at full wattage, the extraordinary haircut that became inexplicably iconic, remains one of football's great moments of redemption. He was, in those years, the purest expression of what a center forward could be when every physical and technical attribute converged in a single body. Van Basten had shown the complete striker could exist. Ronaldo proved it could exist while also being the fastest, most physically dynamic forward the game had seen. But the 1990s and early 2000s weren't solely defined by these two. Around them, a generation of extraordinary center forwards was writing its own chapters. Romario, Van Basten's teammate at Barcelona for one extraordinary season, was a different kind of genius. Small, compact, almost deceptively slight, Romario had no interest in the physical battle. What he had instead was the most refined penalty area instinct of his generation. He scored goals from positions so tight, so seemingly impossible, that defenders looked at replays and still couldn't understand how he had managed it. He and Ronaldo together at the 1994 World Cup, Brazil's winning campaign, formed one of the great striking partnerships in tournament history. Romario as the fox, Ronaldo as the force. Two different expressions of the same truth. Goals were everything, and some men were simply born to score them. Alongside them, in Europe, players like Jürgen Klinsmann in Germany were adding their own verses. Klinsmann was complete in a different way. Technically excellent, tactically intelligent, physically committed in a way that made him simultaneously likable and infuriating to opponents. He led Germany's line with authority and technical quality that earned him wide respect across the continent. Shearer in England, Del Piero in Italy, though his position drifted between the 9 and the 10. Gabriel Batistuta in Argentina, a striker of such ferocious finishing ability that he remains among the most feared center forwards in the history of South American football. Batistuta's record of 56 goals for Argentina stood for years. His performances for Fiorentina, a club that, without him, would have been merely solid, turned him into something approaching a religious figure in Florence. The 1990s were, in many ways, the richest period the center-forward position had ever known. So much variety, so much quality, so many different answers to the same essential question. What should a number 9 be? Physical dominant? Van Basten said yes, but also technically complete. Explosively quick? Ronaldo said yes, but also clinical and creative. A penalty area artist? Romario said yes, but also fearless and instinctive. A complete team player? Klinsmann and Shearer said yes, but also prolific. The position had never been richer, never been more contested, never been more exciting to watch. But even as those answers multiplied, even as the center-forward position seemed to be reaching a kind of golden, fully realized maturity, a new question was forming, quietly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. What if the best thing a number 9 could do was not be a number 9 at all? That question had a name, and it would change football. Chapter 7. The Death and Rebirth of the Number 9. The question arrived quietly, in training sessions, in tactical meetings, in the notebooks of managers who had spent their careers thinking about space, about where it existed on a football pitch, about how it was created, and about who was best placed to exploit it. The question was this: if the center forward is the most closely marked player on the pitch, if defenders have spent decades specifically preparing to neutralize him, if the entire defensive architecture of the modern game is built around eliminating the threat of the number 9, then what happens when the number 9 isn't there? What happens when that space, the space defenders have organized themselves so carefully to protect, is left empty? Who fills it? Who attacks it? And is the player who attacks it more dangerous precisely because he isn't supposed to be there? This was the idea at the heart of the false 9. And like most genuinely revolutionary ideas in football, it didn't arrive as a single moment of invention. It grew, accumulated, drew from threads that had existed for decades, from Hidekuti dropping deep at Wembley in 1953, from Di Stefano covering the entire pitch at Real Madrid, from the fluid attacking movement of Brazil's great sides. But it crystallized, became doctrine, became something managers built entire systems around. And the player who brought it to its fullest, most devastating expression was not a center forward in any traditional sense. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He preferred his left foot almost exclusively. He had begun his career as a winger, and he would go on to become the greatest player the sport has ever seen, Lionel Messi. To understand what Messi did to the number 9 position, what Pep Guardiola asked him to do, and what Messi delivered with a completeness that still feels barely real, you have to understand what Barcelona were building between 2008 and 2012. Guardiola had taken over a Barcelona side already equipped with extraordinary talent and had refined it into something approaching a perfect tactical expression. His team pressed without the ball with collective intensity. With the ball, they played through the lines, short, quick passes that moved defenders out of position and created space in areas that shouldn't theoretically have been available. It was a system built on intelligence, on movement, on the ability to read space before it opened, and at its center, nominally occupying the position of center forward, was Messi. But Messi didn't stay central. He drifted, dropped, arrived from deep in positions that defenders couldn't follow without leaving catastrophic space behind them. He received the ball 30 yards from goal and drove at defenders with a directness and a technical quality that made one-on-one situations feel permanently in his favor. And when he reached the penalty area, arriving late, arriving from angles, arriving as the last man into spaces that his movement had helped create, he finished with a precision that recalled the great poachers of the past. He scored 73 goals in the 2011-12 season across all competitions, a figure so extraordinary that it still requires a moment of stillness to absorb. 73 goals in a single season, for a player who wasn't technically a center forward. The false nine, in Messi's hands, in Guardiola's system, didn't just work. It redefined what was possible. But the false nine was only one part of the story. Because while Messi was reinventing the position from the inside, dissolving its boundaries, refusing its constraints, other managers and other players were asking different questions entirely. What if the number 9 wasn't false at all? What if he was simply more complete than the position had ever previously demanded? Roberto Firmino answered that question at Liverpool under Jurgen Klopp. Firmino was, on paper, a center forward. He occupied the central striking position in Klopp's 4-3-3. He was, nominally, the number 9. But what he did in that role was unlike anything the position had previously asked of its occupants. He pressed, relentlessly, intelligently, with a tactical discipline that made him the foundation of Liverpool's entire defensive structure when out of possession. Firmino's pressing, his ability to cut off passing lanes, force errors from opposition defenders and goalkeepers, trigger the chain reaction that led to Liverpool winning the ball in dangerous positions, was as valuable to Klopp's system as any goal he scored. He was, in a phrase that became attached to him almost immediately, a player without goals who made everything possible. That wasn't entirely fair. Firmino scored important goals, memorable goals, goals that won matches, but it captured something true about his value, his assist numbers, his link play, his movement that created space for Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane on either side of him. He was a number 9 who had agreed to subordinate the traditional demands of the position, the goals, the individual brilliance, the clinical finishing, in service of the collective. And the collective, built around his selflessness, won the Premier League, the Champions League, and almost every other honor available to it. Firmino proved that the number 9 could be the least selfish player on the pitch and still be indispensable. At the same time, another model was asserting itself. In Germany, Robert Lewandowski was doing something that seemed almost deliberately contrary to the false 9 revolution. While Messi was proving goals could come from everywhere, while Firmino was proving the striker didn't need to be the primary scorer. Lewandowski was simply scoring goals, constantly, relentlessly, with a variety and a volume that recalled Gerd Müller, his predecessor at Bayern Munich, while adding a technical dimension that Müller, for all his genius, hadn't possessed. Lewandowski could score with his head, with his left foot, with his right foot, from distance, from close range, in important matches against the best defenders in the world. He scored 41 Bundesliga goals in the 2020-21 season, breaking Müller's record of 40 set in 1971-72 that had stood for nearly 50 years. He was not a false 9. He was not a pressing machine in the Firmino mold. He was a center forward, a pure, classical, devastating center forward, updated for the modern game in terms of his technical quality and his movement, but fundamentally committed to the same truth that Dixie Dean had embodied a century earlier. Score goals, lead the line, be there when it counts. And between Messi and Firmino and Lewandowski, between the false 9 and the selfless 9 and the pure 9, the position had never been more philosophically rich, never more contested, never more interesting, because football was now holding multiple answers simultaneously. The false 9 worked, the pressing 9 worked, the classical 9 worked. and managers across the world were choosing between them or trying to find players who could somehow combine elements of all three with an urgency and a tactical obsession that had made the center forward position the most debated in the sport. Was the number 9 dying? Some said yes, pointed to the rise of systems without a fixed striker, to teams that played with inverted wingers as their primary threat, to the diminishing returns of spending enormous sums on a single focal point when the same money could be spread across a more balanced attacking unit. Was the number 9 evolving? Others said yes, pointed to Lewandowski, to Harry Kane, a striker who combined extraordinary goal scoring with a deep-lying creativity that made him a genuine playmaker as well as a finisher. To Karim Benzema, who reinvented himself at Real Madrid into something approaching the Di Stefano model, a complete footballer operating nominally as a center forward but influencing every phase of play. Benzema won the Ballon d'Or in 2022. At the age of 34, after a career that had spent years in Cristiano Ronaldo's shadow at Real Madrid, years in which his extraordinary technical quality and footballing intelligence had been undervalued because the goals went to someone else, Benzema finally stood alone. And what he showed in those final years at Real Madrid was that the number 9 could age into something more beautiful than it started. That the position, stripped of the explosive pace of youth, rebuilt on intelligence and movement and an almost telepathic understanding of the game, could actually deepen, could become more complete as it became less physical. It was a remarkable thing to witness. And then came Erling Haaland. If Benzema represented the thinking man's evolution of the center forward, Haaland represented something closer to a force of nature. Norwegian, 6 feet 4 inches tall, built like a sprinter despite his height, capable of covering ground at a pace that made experienced fullbacks look stationary, and finishing with a clinical, almost robotic efficiency that recalled Müller more than anyone else in the modern game, with a frequency that broke records almost as a matter of routine. In his first Premier League season at Manchester City, 2022-23, Haaland scored 36 league goals. Breaking the record that had stood since the Premier League's formation, he was 22 years old. He was, in the most visceral sense, a reminder that the classical center forward, the big, powerful, devastating goal scorer, had not been replaced by philosophy. He had simply been waiting for the right team, the right system, the right moment. And when he arrived with a force that made every debate about the death of the number 9 feel slightly embarrassing in retrospect. The position wasn't dying. It was never dying. It was doing what it had always done throughout its entire history. Adapting, evolving, finding new expressions while holding on to its essential core. Because beneath all the tactical debate, beneath the false 9 and the pressing 9 and the complete 9 and the classical 9, the essential truth of the position had never changed. Not since the first center forward stood at the top of a 2-3-5 formation in the late 19th century. Not since Dixie Dean scored his 60th goal. Not since Pelé won his 3rd World Cup. Not since Van Basten volleyed into the top corner. Not since Ronaldo ran half the length of a pitch and still finished with perfect composure. The number 9 existed to score goals. Everything else, all the philosophy, all the tactical innovation, all the reinvention and rebranding and positional evolution, was in service of that single, ancient, irreducible truth. Put the ball in the net. And the players who did it best, regardless of era, regardless of system, regardless of what the position was called or how it was defined, were the ones the game remembered, the ones it still talks about, the ones it always will. Chapter 8. The Legends, the Legacy, and the Shirt That Never Dies. Every position in football has a history, but not every position has a mythology. The number 9 has both. It has the history, the tactical evolution, the positional debates, the systems that tried to replace it and the systems that rediscovered it. The long arc from 2-3-5 formations in Victorian England to Guardiola's pressing machines and Haaland's record-breaking seasons in the modern Premier League. But it also has something else, something harder to define and easier to feel. A weight, a significance that goes beyond statistics and formations and tactical theory. A cultural meaning that has accumulated over more than a century of football, layer upon layer of memory and mythology and expectation, pressed into a single number stitched onto the back of a shirt. No other number carries what the 9 carries. The 10 is celebrated for creativity, for vision, for the playmaker's art. The 1 is revered for courage and last-ditch heroism. The 7 has its own romantic associations, with wingers, with directness, with the kind of individual brilliance that runs down flanks and makes crowds rise. But the 9 is the one that decides things, the one that carries the weight of a team's ambitions into the most important moments of the most important matches, the one that stands over a chance, with thousands watching, with everything at stake, with the margin between success and failure measured in centimeters and fractions of seconds, and has to be calm enough, precise enough, brave enough to take it. That is what the number 9 has always been, and that is what it will always be. But before we close this history, before we let the story settle into memory, it is worth pausing on the players who defined it most completely, the men whose careers, taken together, form the fullest possible picture of what the position can be at its highest level. Not a ranking. Rankings flatten complexity. They invite arguments that miss the point. They reduce careers of extraordinary nuance to a hierarchy that serves debate more than understanding. Instead, consider this a gathering, a room where the greatest number 9s in football history are present simultaneously, where their different qualities, their different expressions of the position, their different answers to the same essential question can exist alongside one another without competition. Dixie Dean is in that room, the man who scored 60 league goals in a single season, who established in the late 1920s a standard of center-forward play in England that defined the position for generations, whose record, set before floodlights, before synthetic pitches, before sports science, before any of the advantages that modern forwards take for granted, has never been touched. He stands at one end of the room, the beginning of everything. Gerd Müller is there, der Bomber, the man who made scoring goals look like an industrial process, systematic, relentless, almost shockingly efficient, who scored 365 Bundesliga goals and 68 international goals, and who won everything there was to win with Bayern Munich and West Germany, who broke records that were supposed to be unbreakable, and who did so without flash, without vanity, without any apparent interest in being celebrated for anything other than the goals themselves. He stands quietly in a corner, not needing to announce himself. The goals do that. Pelé is there, the king, 3 World Cups, more than 1,000 career goals, a player whose actual statistical record is astonishing enough, but whose broader significance, whose cultural weight, whose role in taking football from a sport to a global phenomenon elevates him to a category that exists slightly apart from pure football analysis. He was the first truly global football superstar, the first player whose name was known everywhere, the first number 9 who became a symbol of something larger than the game itself. He stands at the center of the room. Of course he does. Ronaldo R9 is there. The phenomenon. The player who combined pace and power and technique in a way that had never been seen before and hasn't been fully replicated since. Whose peak years, cut cruelly short by injury, produced football of such devastating quality that those who watched it still struggle to describe it adequately. He stands near the door as though he arrived at a sprint and hasn't quite stopped moving. Marco van Basten is there, perhaps the most complete center forward who ever lived, the player who had everything, height, power, technique, movement, finishing ability, and used it all simultaneously, whose career was ended too soon and whose legacy, precisely because of that curtailment, carries a particular kind of ache. What might he have achieved with another decade? The question has no answer, but it haunts the room. Romario is there. Gabriel Batistuta is there. Jimmy Greaves is there. Still criminally underappreciated outside England. Still the owner of a goals-per-game ratio that places him among the most clinical finishers who ever played the position. Alan Shearer is there. Still the Premier League's all-time leading scorer. Still the definitive expression of the English centre-forward tradition in the modern era. Karim Benzema is there, the late bloomer, the patient craftsman who became a complete footballer only after the scaffolding of a more famous partner was removed, and who showed that the number 9 could reach its highest form in its mid-30s. Robert Lewandowski is there, arguably the most complete technical striker of the modern era, a player who combined clinical finishing with intelligent movement and physical presence across a career of remarkable consistency and longevity. And in the corner, not quite fitting within the room's established definitions, existing at the boundary between this gathering and something else entirely. Lionel Messi, who may or may not be a number 9, who may or may not be a center forward in any meaningful sense, but who, by playing in that position, by occupying that space, by wearing that shirt, produced the most extraordinary single-season goal tally in the history of the sport, and forced the position to expand its own definition simply to contain him. They are all here, different eras, different styles, different nationalities, different answers to the same question, and what unites them, the only thing that truly unites them, is that each of them, at their peak, was the most dangerous player on the pitch. Each of them, when the ball arrived at the right moment in the right place, converted it. Each of them carried the weight of the number 9, and none of them dropped it. That is the legacy, not any individual record or trophy or moment of individual brilliance. Though the records and trophies and moments are extraordinary and deserve every word that has been written about them, the legacy is the position itself. The idea that a team needs someone who can be trusted completely in the moments that matter most, someone who can receive the last pass in the last seconds with the game in the balance, and finish. Not always. No striker finishes always. The greatest of them miss, fail, hit the post, drag it wide, fire straight at the goalkeeper when the goal is gaping. That is part of the position too. The misses are inseparable from the goals. The failures are inseparable from the triumphs. The weight of the missed chance, the haunting, public, replayed 1,000 times missed chance, is the price of being the one who gets to score. And the greatest number 9s have always understood that price, have always been willing to pay it, have always stepped forward again, after the miss, after the drought, after the crowd's impatience and the manager's doubts and the journalist's questions, and taken the next chance. That courage, that particular, specific, irreplaceable courage, is what separates the number 9 from every other position on the pitch. Anyone can be brave when there is nothing at stake. The number 9 is brave when everything is. And so the story of the position, stretching from those anonymous halfbacks in Victorian England all the way to Erling Haaland breaking Premier League records in the 2000s, is ultimately not a story about tactics or formations or the evolution of the sport. It is a story about courage, about the particular kind of human being who is drawn to the most exposed, most scrutinized, most consequential position in the most popular sport on earth, who chooses, because it is always a choice at some level, to be the one who decides things, who wears the number, who carries the weight, who steps forward every time. The number 9 has changed beyond recognition since its earliest days. It has been a battering ram and a ballet dancer, a poacher and a playmaker, a target and a ghost, a destroyer and a creator, a classical certainty and a tactical question mark. It has been declared dead, and it has been reborn. It has been simplified, and it has been made impossibly complex. It has been worn by giants, and it has made giants of the men who wore it. But through all of it, through every reinvention and revolution and debate, one thing has remained constant. when the chance arrives, when the ball drops, when the goal is there to be taken. There is a player in that shirt who was born for this moment, who has spent his entire life preparing for exactly this, who steps forward without hesitation and scores. The number 9. It was never just a shirt. It was never just a position. It was a promise made by every player who ever wore it. To the game, to the team, to the crowd, to the moment, a promise to be there when it mattered most, and to deliver. That promise has been kept imperfectly, humanly, gloriously for over a century, and it will be kept again tomorrow, next weekend, in every stadium, on every pitch, in every corner of the world where football is played. The number 9 will step forward, and the game will hold its breath, just as it always has, just as it always will. Chapter 9. The ones who defined it. Some players illustrate a moment in time, others define an entire era, and a rare few, a handful across the entire history of the sport, do something more than either of those things. They define the position itself. This is a chapter about those players, not a ranking, not a hierarchy, but a series of portraits, quiet, considered, unhurried, of the men who wore the number 9 and made it mean something permanent. Each of them answered the same question differently. Each of them was correct. Dixie Dean, the first god. William Ralph Dean was born in Birkenhead in 1907 and became, in the simplest possible terms, the first true legend of the center-forward position. Before Dean, goal scorers were admired. After Dean, they were worshipped. He was everything the position demanded in its earliest, most elemental form, physically imposing, dominant in the air, ruthless inside the penalty area, a player whose presence alone altered how opponents organized themselves. Because if you didn't account for him specifically, individually, as your primary defensive concern, he would punish you with a consistency that felt almost mechanical. His 60 league goals in the 1927-28 season remain the most extraordinary individual scoring record in the history of English football, possibly in the history of the sport. He didn't just break the previous record that season. He needed a hat trick in the final game to reach it. He got it. That detail, that final game, that final hat trick, that final proof of nerve under the most specific and public pressure imaginable, tells you everything you need to know about Dixie Dean. He was built for the moment. He played 433 games for Everton and scored 383 goals. Numbers that belong to a different age entirely, an age of heavy balls and heavy pitches and defenders permitted to make contact that would today result in immediate dismissal. And yet the numbers hold. They have held for nearly a century. They will hold forever. Gerd Müller, the mathematician of goals. If football ever produced a player who seemed specifically engineered to score goals, whose entire physical and psychological construction existed in service of that single function, it was Gerd Müller. He was not tall, not especially quick, not blessed with the kind of technical elegance that made Brazilian forwards look like artists rather than athletes. What he had instead was something rarer. A relationship with the penalty area that bordered on the supernatural. Müller moved in tight spaces the way other players moved in open ones, with certainty, with economy, with a directness of purpose that left defenders consistently half a step behind. His first touch was immaculate under pressure. His finishing, with either foot or his head, was almost never wasteful. He scored 365 Bundesliga goals for Bayern Munich, 68 goals in 62 appearances for West Germany, the winning goal in the 1974 World Cup final, 3 European Cups. His Bundesliga record, 40 goals in a single season, set in 1971-72, stood for nearly 50 years before Robert Lewandowski finally broke it. Müller retired at 28. Walked away from European football at an age when most strikers are approaching their peak. The goals he might have scored in the decade that followed exist only as speculation, but the goals he did score in the years he gave the game are enough, more than enough. They are among the most extraordinary numbers any footballer has ever produced, and they were produced without fuss, without vanity, without any apparent interest in being remembered. Gerd Müller just scored, and scored, and scored. Pelé, the king. There is a version of writing about Pelé that defaults immediately to superlatives, to the greatest of all time, to the king, to the one by whom all others are measured. That version is understandable. It is also insufficient, because Pelé's actual record, stripped of the mythology, examined as plain fact, is extraordinary enough to need no embellishment. He won the World Cup in 1958, aged 17, the youngest player ever to win the tournament, a teenager who arrived on the global stage and immediately looked like he belonged there, not with the tentative quality of youth finding its feet, but with the complete authority of someone who had always known this was where he was supposed to be. He won it again in 1970 with what many consider the greatest international team ever assembled. In between, he was the most recognizable athlete on the planet, the first footballer whose fame transcended sport entirely, who existed in the cultural imagination not just as a player but as a symbol of Brazil, of joy, of what human beings could do with a football when they were operating at the absolute ceiling of their gifts. His goals were many and various. Close-range finishes, long-range strikes, headers, volleys, goals of such outrageous invention that the defenders who conceded them reportedly applauded. He played with a joy that felt genuine rather than performed. That joy, that visible delight in the act of playing, was perhaps his greatest gift to the sport, because football at its best is supposed to look like that, like it matters completely, and like it is also the most fun thing imaginable. Pelé made it look like both simultaneously. Every time he played, Marco van Basten, the most complete. There are strikers who are great, and then there is Marco van Basten. The distinction matters because Van Basten didn't just occupy the upper reaches of the position. He defined its ceiling. He showed, across a career shortened by injury to a length that still feels like a cruel joke, what a center forward could be when every physical and technical quality converged in a single body at its absolute peak. He was tall enough to dominate aerially, strong enough to hold the ball against world-class defenders, quick enough to beat them in behind, technical enough to control the ball under the most extreme pressure with a first touch that belonged in a different category to almost everyone else who played the position. And his finishing was something that exists outside normal assessment. The volley in the 1988 European Championship final, struck first time, from an angle so acute the goal was barely visible, into the top corner of the Soviet net, is not simply one of the great goals in football history. It is a statement about what the position can produce when it reaches its highest expression. Van Basten won 3 Ballon d'Or awards, 3 Serie A titles, 2 European Cups, the European Championship. He retired at 28. The ankle injury that ended his career has never been fully forgiven by football, by the supporters and the historians and the fellow players who watched him and understood with a clarity that required no analysis, that something unrepeatable was being taken from the game. What might he have achieved with another decade of health? The question has no answer, but it is worth sitting with, because the players who make you ask that question, who make you mourn the career they didn't get to finish as much as celebrate the one they had, are always the most special ones. Ronaldo R9. The phenomenon. In the mid-1990s, a teenager emerged from Brazil who made experienced football people, managers, defenders, journalists who had spent decades watching the sport, stop and stare. Not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. Ronaldo Luis Nazario de Lima moved at a speed that felt incompatible with the technical control he maintained. He ran with the ball as though the laws of physics had agreed to make a specific exception in his case, as though pace and touch and balance and composure could coexist at a level that simply shouldn't have been possible. At Barcelona, he was devastating. At Internazionale, he was the best player in the world. At Real Madrid, even after the knee injuries that took years from the peak of his career, he retained enough of his gifts to win a World Cup, score in the final, and remind the sport of what it had almost lost. His 1997 goal for Barcelona in the Cup Winners' Cup, a run from inside his own half, past multiple defenders, finished with a precision that felt contemptuous of the occasion's magnitude, remains one of the great individual goals ever scored. His 2002 World Cup, 8 goals, 2 in the final, the trophy lifted in Yokohama, remains one of the great individual tournament performances ever produced. And the haircut, the inexplicable, iconic, completely indefensible haircut that became somehow as remembered as the goals. Ronaldo was not just a footballer, he was an event. Every time he had the ball in space, something was about to happen. The crowd knew it, the defenders knew it, he knew it, and it happened anyway. Gabriel Batistuta, the Argentine god. There are players who are loved by their clubs, and then there is Gabriel Batistuta and Fiorentina. Batistuta arrived in Florence in 1991 and spent 9 years there. Years during which Fiorentina were relegated, promoted, rebuilt, and reimagined entirely around the force of his presence. He stayed when they went down, stayed when the offers came, stayed because the relationship between a player and a city had become something that transcended football logic. He scored 168 goals in 269 Serie A appearances for Fiorentina. In a league, the Serie A of the 1990s, that was the most tactically sophisticated and defensively organized in the world, against defenders who were, week after week, the best in Europe. He scored them with his right foot, his left foot, his head, from distance, from close range, in important matches against important opponents. He scored a hat trick in 3 consecutive World Cups, a record that still stands. His record of 56 goals for Argentina stood for years before being broken by Messi. And his finishing, that right foot, struck with a power and a precision that made goalkeepers look like they had been placed slightly in the wrong position, was among the most feared in the history of the sport. In Florence, they named a street after him. They put a statue outside the stadium, because Batistuta wasn't just their striker, he was their identity, their proof that a club from outside the very top tier of European football could have, for a sustained and glorious period, the most devastating center forward on the planet. Alan Shearer, the last of the pure English strikers. There is a particular type of center forward that English football has always produced better than anywhere else in the world. Physical, direct, committed, relentlessly focused on the goal and on nothing else. Alan Shearer was the last great expression of that type, and he was more than the type. He broke the British transfer record when Newcastle United paid £15 million to bring him home in 1996, a fee that felt extraordinary at the time, a statement about what a true center forward at the peak of his powers was worth to a club and a city. He repaid it with 260 Premier League goals, a record that still stands, that will stand for a very long time. Shearer was not a false nine, was not interested in dropping deep or linking play or reinventing the position's philosophical parameters. He was a center forward in the most complete and classical sense, powerful in the air, devastating with either foot, an intelligent mover whose runs created space for others even when the ball didn't find him. But he also had something beyond the physical, a desire, a competitive intensity that expressed itself not in aggression, but in relentlessness, in the refusal to stop working, stop running, stop demanding the ball, even when games were going badly and the service was poor. He captained Newcastle with an authority that made him the city's defining sporting figure for a decade. He never won the Premier League. That absence, that single significant gap in an otherwise complete record, is the one thing his career lacked. but 260 Premier League goals in an era of increasingly sophisticated defending on a Newcastle team that never quite gave him the platform his talent deserved. Those goals are their own answer to any question about what he was. Ronaldo, the other one. Before Cristiano Ronaldo became the global superstar who redefined what a modern footballer could achieve through discipline and will and relentless self-improvement, he was something else. A winger, a trickster, a player of extraordinary natural talent who had been signed by Manchester United from Sporting Lisbon in 2003 as a teenager and who arrived in England with skills that were immediately obvious, but a directness and a cutting edge that were still developing. What Cristiano Ronaldo became over the years at United, then at Real Madrid, then at Juventus, was the product of a work ethic so extreme it bordered on the obsessive. He transformed his body, refined his game, eliminated weaknesses with a systematic thoroughness that had no real parallel in the sport. He became a center forward by force of will as much as natural evolution. At Real Madrid, operating as the focal point of the attack, he scored 450 goals in 438 appearances. He won 4 Champions League titles, 5 Ballon d'Or awards, the European Championship with Portugal in 2016. His goals were spectacular in a way that felt deliberate, as though he had decided at some point that not only would he score more than anyone else, but that the manner of his scoring would also be impossible to ignore. Free kicks struck with devastating precision, headers from impossible heights, long-range volleys, clinical one-on-ones finished with controlled composure. Ronaldo was not a natural number 9 in the way Van Basten or Müller were. He was a number 7 who became a number 9 through application and ambition, and in doing so, he scored more goals than almost anyone who ever played the position naturally. Samuel Eto'o, the forgotten great. Football has a habit of undervaluing the players who do everything correctly but never quite fit the dominant narrative of their era. Samuel Eto'o is the most glaring example of that tendency in the modern game. The Cameroonian forward won the Champions League 3 times, twice with Barcelona, once with Internazionale, and scored in both of his European Cup finals. He won 4 African Cup of Nations titles with Cameroon. He was, at his peak in the mid-2000s, one of the 3 or 4 best strikers in the world, and yet his name appears less frequently in conversations about the greats of his generation than his record demands. At Barcelona, alongside Ronaldinho and then Messi, Eto'o was the finisher, the player whose movement and clinical precision converted the creativity around him into goals with a reliability that the team's system absolutely depended on. He was fast, technically excellent, two-footed in a way that made him almost impossible to position against defensively. He scored 130 goals in 199 appearances for Barcelona. In the 2008 to 2009 treble-winning season under Guardiola, a season considered one of the greatest in club football history, Eto'o scored 36 goals across all competitions. He then moved to Internazionale and won the treble again, with a different club, in a different country, under a different manager. The Champions League final goal he scored against Bayern Munich in 2010, a composed, intelligent finish that settled the tie, was the goal of a player at the absolute peak of his powers. History has been slightly unkind to Samuel Eto'o. The record is there to correct it. Didier Drogba, the man for the moment. There are strikers who perform consistently across seasons and years, and there are strikers who perform in the moments that matter most. Didier Drogba was emphatically the second kind. The Ivorian forward spent 8 years at Chelsea across 2 spells and became, in that time, the most important player in the club's history. The man Jose Mourinho called his most important signing, the player Roman Abramovich's enormous investment was ultimately built around in its most successful years. Drogba scored 157 goals for Chelsea, but the number alone doesn't capture what he was. Because Drogba's goals had a habit of arriving precisely when they were most needed. He scored in 4 FA Cup finals for Chelsea, winning all 4. He scored the equalizer in the 2012 Champions League final against Bayern Munich in the 90th minute, when Chelsea were seconds from defeat, when the season was moments from ending without the one trophy that had always eluded the club. He then scored the winning penalty in the shootout, in Bayern's own stadium, in front of their own supporters, with the composure of a man for whom this was not pressure, but purpose. That night, that single night in Munich, encapsulates everything Drogba was. He was not the most technically gifted striker of his generation. He was not the most prolific, not the most decorated. But in the biggest moments of the biggest matches, Didier Drogba was the most dangerous forward on the planet. And that specific irreplaceable quality is worth as much as any goal tally. Luis Suarez, the most competitive man alive. There have been strikers who wanted to score more than Luis Suarez. Actually, no, there haven't. The Uruguayan forward brought to the center forward position a competitive intensity so extreme, so all-consuming, so completely indifferent to social convention or sporting politeness that it occasionally crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. The biting incidents, the handball on the goal line at the 2010 World Cup, the controversies that followed him from Liverpool to Barcelona to Atletico Madrid like an uncomfortable shadow. But also, the goals. The extraordinary, relentless, inventive, unstoppable goals. At Liverpool, between 2011 and 2014, Suarez produced one of the great individual spells of Premier League goal scoring in the competition's history. In 2013-14, he scored 31 goals in 33 league appearances, a return that would have won the Golden Boot in almost any other season by a distance. That year, it wasn't enough to win the title. Liverpool finished second. The campaign remains one of the great near misses in the competition's history. He won the Golden Shoe, the award for Europe's top scorer, that season. At Barcelona, alongside Messi and Neymar in the most devastating attacking trio of the modern era, Suarez scored 198 goals in 283 appearances. He won La Liga, the Copa del Rey, and the Champions League. He was technically exceptional, two-footed, brilliant in the air for a player of his height, creative in ways that recalled the false nine without him ever fully occupying that role. But what made Suarez different, what separated him from the merely great, was that refusal to accept the situation as given, that insistence in every moment of every match that there was a way, a goal, an angle, a possibility that hadn't yet been exhausted. He was infuriating, brilliant, impossible to ignore, the most competitive man who ever wore the number 9. Sergio Aguero, the greatest Premier League striker. There is a moment that every football fan who watched it will carry with them forever. 93 minutes and 20 seconds, Manchester City versus Queen's Park Rangers. The final day of the 2011-12 Premier League season, City needing to score twice in stoppage time to win their first league title in 44 years. Sergio Aguero received the ball 30 yards from goal, drove at defenders, entered the penalty area, struck. The ball hit the net. Martin Tyler's commentary, 3 words, repeated, became the most famous piece of football broadcasting in Premier League history. Aguero! That goal, that single, seismic, almost impossibly dramatic goal, would have been enough to secure Aguero's place in Premier League history on its own. But it was not the sum of him. It was one moment in a career of sustained, extraordinary brilliance. Aguero spent 10 years at Manchester City and scored 260 goals in 390 appearances across all competitions. He is the Premier League's highest-scoring overseas player. He scored 5 goals in a single Premier League game. He scored hat-tricks with a regularity that made them seem almost routine. He was compact and low to the ground in the way that the best South American forwards often are, balanced, explosive in short distances, almost impossible to knock off the ball when he had established a position. His movement in the penalty area recalled the great poachers of earlier generations: Romario's instinct, Miller's economy, Dean's certainty about where the ball was going to arrive. But he also had pace, skill, the ability to create chances from nothing when service was poor. He was, for a decade, the most reliable goal scorer in the Premier League. And he did it at Manchester City, a club that during his time there transformed from perennial nearly men into the dominant force in English football. He was part of the reason for that transformation, a significant part. Aguero! Harry Kane, the thinking man's striker. Harry Kane arrived in the Premier League with a reputation built on loan spells and youth football and a general sense, unfair as it turned out but persistent, that he was a good player rather than a great one. He has spent the decade since systematically dismantling that assessment. Kane is, in the most complete technical sense, the finest English striker of his generation. His goal return is extraordinary. He surpassed Wayne Rooney's England scoring record and has maintained a goals-per-game ratio at club level that places him among the most prolific strikers in Premier League history. But what makes Kane genuinely fascinating, what elevates him from the category of excellent goal scorer into something more philosophically interesting, is the completeness of his game. He drops deep, collects the ball in midfield spaces, links play with a first touch and a passing range that recall a number 10 more than a traditional center forward. His assist numbers across his career are remarkable for a striker, evidence of a player who has consciously expanded the position's definition to include genuine creative responsibility. At Tottenham, he was the focal point of everything. The player, the entire attacking structure was built to serve, and the player who served others in return with a generosity that pure goal scorers rarely exhibit. At Bayern Munich, where he moved in 2023, he has continued to score with a frequency that suggests the end of his peak years is not yet remotely visible. He has never won a major trophy. That absence, like Shearer before him, is the one gap in a record that should by now include silverware to match its individual brilliance. But the goals are there, the completeness is there, and the career is not yet finished. Robert Lewandowski, the modern machine. If you were building a center forward from scratch, designing the position's ideal physical and technical specification, you might end up somewhere close to Robert Lewandowski. The Polish striker combined across his peak years at Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich every quality the modern game demands of its number 9. He was powerful enough to hold the ball against the best defenders in Europe, quick enough to beat them in behind, technical enough to control difficult passes under pressure and create space from nothing, clinical enough, with both feet and his head, to convert chances at a rate that placed him in the company of the greatest goal scorers the sport has ever produced. He scored 41 Bundesliga goals in the 2020-21 season, breaking Gerd Müller's record of 40 set almost 50 years earlier. That achievement, in the context of modern defending, modern goalkeeping, modern tactical sophistication, is as remarkable as almost any individual scoring record in the history of the sport. He has won league titles in Germany and Spain, Champions League, individual awards too numerous to list exhaustively, and he has done it with a professionalism, a commitment to preparation, to physical conditioning, to the continuous refinement of his game, that recalls Cristiano Ronaldo's approach without the theatrical self-presentation. Lewandowski just worked and produced, season after season, goal after goal, without drama, without noise, the most reliable center forward of his generation, the machine that never broke down. Erling Haaland, the future already here. And then there is Erling Haaland, who arrived at Manchester City in the summer of 2022 and immediately made every conversation about the Premier League's all-time great strikers feel slightly provisional. Not because those conversations were wrong, but because Haaland, at 21, at 22, at an age when most strikers are still developing the full range of their qualities, was already producing numbers that the greatest forwards in the competition's history had spent entire careers building. 36 Premier League goals in his debut season, breaking the record set by Andy Cole and Alan Shearer, players who had spent years accumulating the reputation and the experience that Haaland seemed to arrive with fully formed. He is 6 feet 4 inches tall and moves with a pace that feels physically improbable for someone of his height. He finishes with a clinical efficiency that recalls Müller, the same economy, the same certainty, the same refusal to be flustered by the weight of the moment. At Manchester City, in Pep Guardiola's system, a system designed, ironically, around the false nine, around the absence of a traditional center forward, Haaland arrived and simply scored goals. Constantly, repeatedly, from crosses and cutbacks and through balls and set pieces and situations that previous City strikers had been asked to avoid in favor of more complex patterns. He scored them all. Is he the finished article? Almost certainly not. There is development still to come, refinement still to be achieved, moments of adversity still to be navigated. But what he has already done, at the age at which he has done it, is enough to place him in the conversation, not provisionally, not with caveats. In the conversation, with Müller, with Ronaldo, with Van Basten and Pelé and every other player who ever made the number 9 feel like more than just a position. They are all different, all of them, different countries, different eras, different physical types, different answers to the question of what the position demands. But walk into that room, the room where all of them exist simultaneously, and you feel something immediately, a shared quality, not technique, not pace, not power or vision or any single measurable attribute, something harder to name, a certainty, a belief, deep, unshakable, almost irrational in its completeness, that when the moment arrived, they would be equal to it. That the ball would come, that the chance would appear, that they would score. That certainty, that particular, irreplaceable, unteachable certainty is what made them number 9s. Not the shirt, not the position, that. Thank you for being here, and that is where we leave it. The number 9, from the muddy pitches of Victorian England to the gleaming stadiums of the modern game, from Dixie Dean to Erling Haaland, from a shirt assigned by mathematics to a symbol carrying more than a century of mythology. Thank you for spending this time with echoes of the pitch. If you made it this far, if the story carried you through the night, if the words kept you company as everything else fell quiet, then this was exactly what it was made for. This channel exists for the moments between wakefulness and sleep, for the space where the mind slows and the game becomes something softer, not tactics and tension and 90 minutes of anxiety, but history, memory, the long, beautiful story of football told slowly enough to actually feel. If you enjoyed this one, there is more waiting for you. The history of football tactics, the greatest midfielders the game has ever seen, the entire story of the Champions League, the Ballon d'Or, El Clasico, the Premier League, the World Cup, the greatest what-ifs the sport has ever produced. All of it told the same way, quietly, carefully, for you. So rest now. The game will still be there in the morning. The goals, the records, the players who made you fall in love with football in the first place, they aren't going anywhere. They are part of the story now. And so are you. Good night.